From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Burke, and in every Blue Sky episode, we'll be speaking to leaders, researchers, and thinkers whose stories and insights will remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. There are people in this world who seem to be born connectors, possessing a natural interest and ability to bring people together. My guest today is most definitely one of these. He's someone I met in 2022, and in the time since, he's introduced me to some terrific people who've also been great guests on Blue Sky. Sam Pressler is a community builder, researcher, and writer focused on issues at the intersection of civic life and social connection. As a practitioner fellow in democracy at the Karsh Institute of Democracy at the University of Virginia, he's experimenting with a new self-sustaining, self-governing network of place-based civic leaders. Sam is also a research affiliate at the Harvard Human Flourishing Program and writes the Connective Tissue newsletter on the connections, communities, and commitments that bind us together. Previously, he founded and served as the executive director of the Armed Services Arts Partnership, America's largest community arts organization serving veterans and their families. I hope you enjoy this Blue Sky conversation with Sam Pressler as much as I did. Sam Pressler, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Excited to be here.
I'm so happy to have you on. You have been a great resource to me. It feels like about half the guests I've had were referred to you from your amazing network, and finally get a chance to talk to the source himself. So thank you.
Yeah. I am fortunate to have friends that are more interesting than I am. So,
well, we'll see about that. Speaking of interesting, I've taken a real liking to something that I see on all your social media, and whenever I read about you, you say that you are making your grandmothers proud. Where does that come from, and is that an inspiration for you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely is. I was the firstborn on both sides of my family, both immediate family and extended. And so, with my my dad's mom, Grandma Sandy, who recently passed away, my dad used to, make jokes that I was kind of baby Jesus, like I could do no wrong in her eyes. And then my grandma Susan, who's still with us, we just have like a very special connection. I would say so much of my writing, my ability to write and learn how to write comes from her and her support. And so I think, especially just growing up Jewish, there's a very, the role of the matriarch and the grandma in the Jewish family plays quite strong. And so I think, I've always, in the back of my mind, I think there have been these two very different grandmas in my life who both loved me in really significant ways. And I think my grandma Sandy, who was like the most social person I know, like it was hard to get on her calendar because she had all these different, into her 80s, all these different social events going on. I think she really told me what it looked like to kind of commit to community and commit to family and really kind of be kind of the lifeblood of that, which is such a part of my life and has been a part of my life. And then I think my grandma Susan was really the most intellectual person in my life and really shaped how I kind of think about the world from a more philosophical and theoretical perspective. So I feel like I have both of those lineages within me.
It's a great mission. I think a lot of us, even if we didn't have those kind of relationships with our grandparents or grandmothers, it's a great way to think about how you want to live your life by making them proud. So I'm glad I remembered to ask you that.
I love that question. Thank you.
Yeah. So you have a very impressive academic background, including getting an MBA from a very prestigious program. And yet one of the first things you did, I'm saying yet because it's not the usual path for someone out. I want to start with, we're going to talk more about connective tissue and the work you're doing today, but the Armed Services Arts Partnership. Can you explain how you got that idea, why you got that idea, why you pursued it so effectively?
Yeah. So There's the most honest story, which I feel a little more free to tell now that I'm not responsible for the organization, which is like, I was 20 years old. I was an undergrad at William and Mary in Virginia. And like, I came back to campus one semester, kind of like not that excited about my classes and wanting to do something that was kind of closer to what I was energized by or passionate about from like a really young age, which was humor and comedy and then service. And so I basically was like, let me do something at the intersection of humor and service. Here, let's do a stand-up comedy class for some population, which is not what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to say like, here's a solution, let's find a problem. But being in Hampton Roads, Southeast Virginia, and there's a very big military population. I also have kind of larger connection to the military in my family. And then just through some very basic research, learning about some of the challenges that veterans face and kind of reconnecting with their community after the military, and kind of coping post the military experience, and think about how comedy helped me connect with people, comedy helped me cope. I was like, all right, let's just do this stand-up comedy class for veterans. And I think there's something really beautiful in not knowing what you don't know. Like, I had never actually done stand-up comedy before. I had never worked with veterans.
I assumed you had. You just like comedy.
I liked it. I did sketch comedy stuff in high school, but never stand up. And so we just did it. And it was one of these things, like I say, if you're going to start anywhere doing the arts with the military, start with comedy. Don't start with like poetry or figure painting. And so we did this first class. It struck a nerve. We had a ton of interest in doing the class. We had a ton of interest in kind of continuing to engage with fellow veterans and in the arts after. And so basically over the course of my senior year in college, added this whole thing called the William Mary Center for Veterans Engagement with all these different arts programs. We had like music, we had writing, we had a bunch of different stuff. And it was over the course of that year where I was like, oh, there might be something here that's bigger than just a student project, where, we were getting a ton of anecdotal evidence of how this was positively benefiting people's lives. We were, on CNN and on NPR getting all this media attention. And I just saw there was this thread that was happening in the country at that time of like community plus blank working with veterans. So there was a group called Team Red, White, and Blue that does like community plus physical activity. There was a group called Team Rubicon, which does like community plus kind of disaster relief or service. And I was like, I think there's a lane here of community plus arts. And so long and the short, over the course of my senior year, I was able to get funding to take the student group and turn it into this more nationally oriented nonprofit called the Armed Services Arts Partnership.
Incredible. And is that as far as I can tell, that's still ongoing and thriving? And
yeah. And I it's been so cool. So I've been gone from it for 5 years, right? Which is wild. Like it's gonna be 10 years old, officially 10 years old in May. And really it's already over 10 years old, plus considering the student work that I did. And I always say the best thing I did with ASAP was leave. And I mean it from the sense of like, I left from a position of strength in the organization. I kind of felt where I took it as far as I could. And then it was time for a new leader to take it forward. And the guy who took over for me, Brian Jenkins, has done a really good job of just kind of building on the momentum we have and taking it to an entirely new level. But just a little background on what it does. It's in now, I think, 4 different regions of the country. And what we do is essentially partner with the local community arts ecosystem in a place. So your like improv theaters, your comedy clubs, your, acting classes, all of that. And we partner with the local military and veteran ecosystem. And the goal is really to activate both of those kind of communities that typically aren't interacting with each other to provide veterans with access and then sustained engagement in the arts. And so that typically looks like a class that's 8 weeks long, followed by kind of ongoing programming with the community arts partner. And what we find is just, when you participate in the arts with fellow veterans and just kind of continue to engage in community, it produces these sustained benefits in, sense of purpose and meaning in life, sense of connection with other people, renewed skills after leaving the military. And ultimately that makes, a more flourishing life on the other side.
And you're a humble guy because you said, well, I just sort of put it together. These things aren't easy. Finding the people, making it happen. It's really, I'm sure there was incredible persistence and diligence on your part. These things just don't happen.
Well, just on that point, I think, and I know you've interviewed a lot of people who are doing the kind of this community building work. And I think the lesson you learn pretty quickly is that a single individual leader can only do so much. And there's this
Yeah.
really big mismatch between like the media narratives around like, oh, like this
Yeah.
intrepid entrepreneurial leader
Yeah.
and like what actually happens. And what actually happens, and I think in addition to leaving at the right time, one of the other things that I think in hindsight we did well was I was like, I don't know what I'm doing. Like I was 20 years old. I didn't do comedy. I didn't have a connection to the military. And so we just put the people in our community at the center of all the decision making. And I think what that did was like help cultivate a community and design a set of programs that were very aligned with what people wanted. And so like, just for instance, all of our classes are taught by the alumni who've gone through the classes. So it's all a train the trainer program. And like, I would have never thought of that on the front end. I didn't know anything about that. And we started teaching these comedy classes like, hey, and the veterans who graduated were like, hey, we could teach this. And so we built out a mentorship program and a teacher training program. And so I think, yes, obviously there was a lot of effort and consistency on my part, but you take a step back and there's, whether it's the leaders of the classes who are doing it, whether it's the staff that you have in an organization, as you know, or just the thousands of people who are making personal sacrifices every weekend to either show up to volunteer, to get babysitting for their kids so they can go take a comedy class. Like these are, it's so clearly a communal and shared effort that like taking any sense of responsibility or ownership for that success, it's like, no, this is so much bigger than any one person.
I led off by asking Sam about making his grandmas proud, because this notion struck me as a great way to think about how we might want to live our lives. And Sam is no doubt making his grandmas proud with his work today. And like so many great and optimistic entrepreneurs, Sam didn't let a lack of experience get in his way when he decided to marry humor with service and start the Armed Services Arts Project. And at a very young age, he had a healthy understanding for how little doing leaders actually do. And he filled in his own knowledge and experience gaps by building a team to turn this organization into the success it continues to be. Eventually, Sam decided to move on from this work, and I asked him how he thought about what he wanted to do next.
The honest answer is I had no idea what to do after I left that organization. In many ways, like I had to experience the type of intense transition that a lot of the people in the military who were coming into our program were experiencing. And despite being around thousands of people who were doing that, I managed to not have any idea of how to do it once I did it myself. And so I ended up, there was a few things that happened. One was COVID struck right as I started my transition process, which, having no idea what to do with your life and then having the world blow up was interesting. And then, I basically had seen school as a very generative experience for me in the past. It's like how I started that organization. And I was like, school could be a generative experience again. And where we met when I was at Harvard, I think was particularly generative when I was there, because I really just made it the fellowship I had there allowed me to do one independent research every semester and then take whatever classes I want. And so I just was trying to follow these threads that were of interest to me. And the threads that kept coming up were like threads around community, threads around the future of religion and spirituality and religion in my own life. And it was just getting exposed to these different, more social sciences types of folks like, Raj Chetty or Robert Putnam or Theda Skocpol, but then also taking classes at Vinny School and taking classes on Thomas Merton or reading about Rabbi Heschel. Wow. I just started to connect the dots and it's like, oh, like the thing that energized me before, like, why was I working with military and veterans and comedy? Like I wasn't an artist. I wasn't a veteran. And the thing that's continuing to energize me now is like this idea of how do we connect or how do we reconnect people to the community's commitments, connections that give our lives meaning or make our lives worth living. And so I don't think the way I go about my life is necessarily, I wouldn't recommend other people do it. I wouldn't maybe even recommend myself do it. But like, I've just been following these threads since. And I think that's kind of where that initial spark came from.
Yeah, and this is ambitious work. I looked at your website and I pulled this, what you said, this is what you're working on. Generations of lost communal vision, forgotten civic practices, and eroding civic infrastructure. not like snap your fingers and fix these things. How do you think about this massive undertaking? Well, the massive change you're trying to be a part of. How do you think about that, and how do you stay optimistic and persevere when this is not easy work?
Yeah. So I actually think the first way that the source of my hope, or I don't even know if it's I would say really hope, is just recognizing that like the things that are really worth doing, in my view, are generational work, right? Like it's not one and done quick fix. It's generational work. There's an incredible quote from Reinhold Niebuhr: "Nothing that is worth doing can be achieved in our lifetime. Therefore, we must be saved by hope. Nothing which is true or beautiful or good makes complete sense in any immediate context of history. Therefore, we must be saved by faith. Nothing we do, however virtuous, can be accomplished alone. Therefore, we must be saved by love. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Therefore, we must be saved by the final form of love, which is forgiveness."
Ooh.
And this is that, I think that particularly that first point around the generational piece, I see us right now as in a pretty significant low point in terms of our sense of community, our sense of solidarity. And, part of the narrative, I would say, is like we had, and this is an oversimplified narrative, but we had a few different major moments in kind of the last 2 centuries that have like forced us to ask fundamental questions around: what does it mean to live a good life? What does it mean to live a good life in community?
Yep.
The first that I'll point to is kind of industrialization. What happens when you have all these people move from agrarian areas and small towns into the city? And particularly, when there are a particular disruption that happens, both in terms of our kind of social infrastructure to support those people, in terms of people's behaviors, like young men going to brothels and gambling and drinking excessively. And in that void, we see what becomes the social gospel of the late 19th century, early 20th century, where we start building settlement houses. A lot of the voluntary organizations that Bob Putnam talks about in Bowling Alone and the Upswing are formed. And we actually create this social support structure around one another to build community. That ends up peaking and starting to decline in the 1960s. And get to the point where Putnam writes Bowling Alone in 2000, and there's this like hope that the internet, right, is going to be this great, technology and the internet is going to be this great connector and may fill that void. And I think we're at the end of that narrative. I can say pretty concretely that we're at the end of that narrative.
Not looking good. Yeah, not looking good.
And I think partially because of that kind of question of what comes next, I think we're now asking kind of fundamental questions of what does it mean to build this next generation of civic life? What does it look like in the social structures? What does it look like in the economic structures? What does it look like culturally? And my hunch is that it's going to be a dance between cultural and quite frankly, spiritual change, like people kind of awakening to the fact that we need one another and we need to be in community with one another. And that requires not only benefiting ourselves, but kind of finding meaning and purpose through sacrificing for others and caring for others. I think that's going to require pretty significant structural and policy change to kind of both push back against some of the policies that have been in place that have hindered or made it more difficult for people to form connections, and also potentially identify policies that can enable more connectedness. And then I think it's going to require a lot of rebuilding of community from the bottom up rather than the top down. And a lot of kind of the people you've already had that I know I've referred to I think are at the cutting edge of doing that. Someone like Teju Revolution or Barrett Takesian who are starting to do that work of what it looks like to rebuild community.
I love history. So that was a great walkthrough. and as I recall from Bowling Alone and Join or Die, Pete Davis is another whose great documentary reflected on the work of Putnam. He, I think, leans heavily towards television as the thing that started pulling us apart a little bit during the 60s. And then, this hope that maybe this next technology of social media could pull us together. And I'm with you that that's not looking great. However, I think it's fair to say that technology, the internet, we could rethink and reuse, and even the work that you're doing with a Substack and things like that. That wasn't possible in the 1960s. You can't even imagine putting out a weekly newsletter that could be consumed electronically by an infinite number of people. So my hope too would be, and I wonder your thoughts on this, that we can sort of rethink how we use these tools that have been directed in a certain way over the last several years, and maybe corral them back.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested in your perspective on this because you're a media guy. You're a media executive. I mean, I had this aha moment, which sounds extraordinarily simple, probably to you, given your media cred. But I was in basically a business, the economics of media and entertainment class at Stanford Business School.
Yep.
And the professor said this very simple line, which is like, the business model of a media company is to capture as much leisure time as possible.
Yeah.
And I was like, if Netflix and Facebook and TikTok and all of these companies, if their fundamental business model is to make sure that I'm spending as much time in front of a streaming service or in front of my social media platform, and they have hundreds of billions of dollars to invest in ensuring that's the case, your little schmucky community organization that is run by the volunteer is wildly outmatched. And so I think, we saw this with television in some ways, right? To your point, right?
Absolutely.
It's easier to get easy entertainment in my home than it is to go out into my community. And now, and that was one of the things Putnam pinpointed in terms of when people stopped going out. Now, I mean, it's invaded all elements of our lives, and is designed algorithmically to keep us attached to it.
Yep.
And so I think that kind of piece of like, we need to claw back at our leisure time feels really essential. And I guess I wonder to you, because there's clearly a hope or an optimism around how these tools could be repurposed. Like, what does it look like to build business models and to design structures that enable that rather than kind of compete with that? Because that feels like a really wicked problem in all of this.
No, you're making great points. And it's funny too. And by the way, I ask the questions around here, but just it's interesting now when I reflect back on Putnam's conclusion, which I don't necessarily disagree with, that television started that disintegration. But now it's funny as you look back, early television, at least like, a third, half the population was watching the same show and talking about the same show at work the next day. I mean, there's in the nostalgia of looking back at that is sort of like, we were staying at home, but at least we were having this shared experience. Now it's like, have you streamed that new show on blah, blah, blah? And it's like, no, because there's 5,000 others. Anyway, so there's been a sort of an atomizing of the audiences. But I think it's like a lot of things, Sam, where the first step is admitting you have a problem, or the first step is understanding what is being done to you. Like what that professor told you is very helpful. And one of the things I try to tell people is that, like, Facebook is really good. These social media platforms are really good at engaging you, but you're opting in. You're liking stuff that's making you angrier. You're forwarding stuff that's going to feed you more of that stuff because you're forwarding it. And it's like, let's call a timeout, understand what's being done to us. And I'm loving all the literature I'm seeing about how to quit your phone. I think what Jonathan Haidt is doing, I think the service he is doing, he's controversial, and some of what he's proposing, people think are too extreme. I don't think we need cell phone. I don't think we need social media in high school, elementary, middle school class. We just don't. It's not fair to the teachers. It's not fair to the parents. And so that's a trend. And I was asked recently on a show that's allowed to ask me questions by design, make some bold prediction for 2025. And I was just winging it. But I think this might be true. This might be the first year in, I don't know how long, and I don't even know how we measure this, the people actually consume less media than they did the year before. I'm feeling it from a lot of friends, a sense of fatigue after the last election. If Haidt's work and just the work of states and school districts to take phones out of schools, that would make a huge difference, because we know the crazy number of hours that young people are spending on social media. That's where I'm hopeful that we start understanding this. And then I'm sure you've seen this. The Atlantic, the cover story was the anti-society generation?
Yeah, the antisocial century.
Antisocial, thank you. We're figuring this out. And they had statistics, I think it was in there, about the number of minutes people are spending in their homes compared to pre-pandemic. It's come back a little bit, but barely since the pandemic. And I think, again, we're understanding this is an issue. This is something, and we feel like something's missing. So that's my hope. It could be a naive hope, but I think the fact that people like you are working on this and we're talking about this is a huge first step. As you can now see, Sam Pressler is a very thoughtful and intentional person. And during his studies, he gave a lot of thought to the idea that we were losing a sense of community in this country, and that this was a huge issue that needs attention. As we discussed, Robert Putnam wrote about this 25 years ago in Bowling Alone, and many of the concerns he identified then were only made worse by the growth of the internet and smartphones, and then accentuated by the COVID crisis. The work Sam has set out to do is daunting, but I agree with him that it's vitally important. And one of the headwinds we're all facing here is the media's demands on our time. Sam said he was taught that media companies want as much of your leisure time as they can command, and that's true. But I'd add that making matters worse today, they're also coming after your work time, your waking time, as much of any of your time as they can get. So older people like me look for inspiration from young people like Sam. So let's get back to more of that.
This goes back to, I think, the interaction between kind of culture change and structural change, right? Yes. What we saw, if we take the pandemic example and go into it, I mean, what we saw was a change in how we lived our lives, which was then instantiated into these structures through which we lived our lives. So much, we're dealing with so many lingering consequences of the pandemic, just technologically, right? Like the kind of collective shift towards remote and hybrid work as one example of like kind of, even this is a good use of a video technology. Yeah. But the way in which it's just everything, and there's evidence of this in the community literature, that a lot of community groups shifted permanently to online. And so even if you want to do community work, it's like going virtual. And so I think like we talk about like the growth of food delivery and all of these things where like all the little mundane day-to-day interactions that would have gotten you out of the house are now instantiated into technological structures that keep you in the house more. And I think that's the structural piece, but the cultural piece is what you're speaking to. If we're feeling this collective angst of like, oh, this is not how I want to live, I feel so cooped up, the hope, and this will take collective action, much like you're talking about with Height's work, like a collective action shift to get people to say, no, this is not how I want to live, right? And like we're going to collectively start to do more things in person, in community with one another on the overall level. So I think that's the hopefulness. I think the thing that's worth keeping an eye on is, and the Atlantic tends to fall particular victim to this given their audience, is we tend to talk about like these communal issues as like middle and upper middle class lifestyle issues. And if you just look at the literature on usage of technology, and this has been the case before social media, but since as well, both kids and adults, the usage of TV, of social media apps is much higher among people without college degrees, lower socioeconomic status people. And so what we also want to be aware of is a world in which it's not just like more educated people, more well-off people who are able to kind of build the structures to have more offline life, that we can kind of make something that's more universal overall.
I'm glad you made that last point too, because you were asking me about my august career in media. And one of the things went way back, I've been out of it for a long time, but when we would go through recessionary periods and look at businesses like back then, HBO, quote unquote, pay TV and cable distribution, the statistics were staggering, where you literally in the lowest income homes, like they would cut their heat before they cut their cable. I mean, it was like, that was such a lifeline and such a big part of life. And you touched on a controversial subject, and I get to ask you about this, work from home, because I'm fascinated by this. I used to run some organizations. I don't anymore. And I have great sympathy for people trying to sort this out, because I totally get the convenience and taking commutes out of people's lives and taking cars off the road and those sorts of benefits of work from home. But I do worry that it accentuates this isolation. And as someone who finds, small talk awkward, I do. It's even more awkward on Zoom. You
Yeah,
can't
totally.
you can't have those hallway to the meetings, after the meetings. Hey, let's grab lunch. It just doesn't happen on Zoom. So I'd love to know your thoughts about that, and then we'll talk some more about your connective tissue work.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think this element of work is a huge piece of the equation around connection. And I think to the point just before, there's two very different conversations about this, right? I think there's people who are working in service and retail work who never got to work from home and still aren't working from home.
Healthcare, sure. Yeah.
And in that group, the issue is not necessarily the weirdness of Zoom. The issue, and I actually did an interview with one of my advisors at Harvard, Danny Schneider, who looks at basically the social lives of people who are working in the retail and service sectors. And what you find is that you have less control over your schedule. So you don't know what your schedule is going to be next week. So you can't plan to do anything in community. Then in the workplace, you have less overlap with kind of similar peers in your schedule. So you can't even build those connections within the workplace. And then, by the way, like because of all those scheduling shifts, you're tapping more into your social capital networks or your social networks to, like, let's say, arrange for childcare if you need to switch at the last second, that are already likely less strong because of all these other factors. And so in that group, there's this element of work being potentially quite punitive because of its instability, its unpredictability, its precarity. So that's one set of challenges work. Then now, if you look at people who are like knowledge workers able to work remote, I think, I can just speak from my firsthand experience, and I'm sure you can as well. There's something extremely isolating. Like I feel connected to you vis-a-vis this platform, but it would be so much better if we were in person. So there's something extremely isolating about it. There's something extremely fatiguing about it. Like the interaction with, it's like a drain on the body. There's something in many ways that distorts time. Like time moves in a different way. And then I think, what we see in the research is like your in-person work relationships, if you have the benefit of being able to be in person and work and stable, consistent work, that's one of the primary sources of friendship for people. Absolutely. And so if you're not getting that in an in-person environment, you're losing this essential source of friendship. And that's important at different parts of the life course, but particularly thinking you're in your 20s or 30s, maybe you don't yet have kids, like that's going to be a huge source of friendship in your life. And so in this way, I think the things are, I will say, from a social connectedness perspective, a community perspective, the research I did last summer with the Survey Center on American Life really shows us there's a huge class divide in access to friendships and access to civic opportunity, all of these things. And things seem to be worse for everyone. And both of those things can be true at the same time.
Yep. Fascinating. So let's talk about your policy work. Right now we've been talking about corporations or businesses, work settings. You've decided to put together a policy framework for government. And some would say, why government? You mentioned this needing to be a bottom up, but you wrote this framework, and I assumed it was going to be about 8 pages or something. It's 182 pages. This was serious work. This is basically like writing a book. And it's fantastic. And but tell me what are your thoughts about how can government help us with this? What are the keys in that framework that you would encourage people to think about and for them to push their own local, state, federal government officials to work on?
Yeah. So like you said, it was 140 pages. One of those things that I definitely didn't realize fully what I was signing up for when I started, how big the question was. And so what follows, I'll just say, like, go take a look at, I'm sure we can put in the show notes, like take a look at the framework and actually dig into it, because there's a lot there. I'll tackle this in a few different ways. Like, top line, I think there is something along like just principles through which we can think about how government interacts with communities.
Yep.
And there's obviously a change in administration happening. The focus of this framework really has much less to do with the federal side than compared to state and local. Obviously, federal plays a role, but as I was going through this process, there were really two principles that stood out that were essential to kind of seeing government as more of as playing more of a positive role in promoting connection in people's life. First was a kind of a more push to the local level, like more of a localism, making government feel more proximate and essentially like actually pushing more responsibilities to state and local government rather than a big kind of centralized action to help people build connection. I don't think that's where it's going to happen. The second thing is we're seeing these real questions around expertise and technocracy and like kind of informed decisions and measurable outcomes. And I kind of put this spectrum from kind of technocratic interventions to more participatory, small d democratic forms of government. And I think there's a real orientation of government to open itself up to as an avenue for participation. And as one of your past guests, Pete Davis, said, blur the lines between insiders and outsiders. I think that's like a really essential reorientation of government. Now, if we look at specific things government can do, the one that I often talk about that feels it's one that's commonly brought up is around kind of service during this period of the adult transition. Yes. If we look at the data, the adult transition has now become the great sorter of American life. We have one class of people that goes to four-year colleges, particularly selective four-year colleges, and it accelerates your social networks, all these different things. And if you don't go to college, we don't have a structured alternative pathway. And so what we see is not only due to that, but partially due to that is massive class divides in community participation, in friendships, in social support, divided by the college degree. The way you also like that period of time throughout human history, like this transition into adulthood is typically seen as a rite of passage in forming the kind of community members and the adults and the men and women that we become. And that is also missing in our society. Obviously you could have a bar mitzvah in Judaism, like there's all these different cultural things, but they're not really getting at that full rite of passage. And so there is this opportunity to take some of the insights that come from military service, which is kind of working with people across lines of difference, having learning skills that can help you serve in your community, cultivating a sense of purpose and connecting to something bigger than yourself. That can be translated through other forms of service that are beyond the military. And there have been efforts to do national public service. Those have stalled. But there's been this emergence of state level public service efforts. So in Maryland, they're doing state level service years for adults right after college, supported by the state and through some philanthropic support to go serve a year in your community. But the important thing is it's got a living wage, it's got benefits, it got vocational benefits to go either to voc school or college afterwards. And it's built in a cohort experience that emphasizes social capital development. And that's real. It's still small, but that's happening in Maryland. It's happening in California. A few other states are getting really excited about it. So you can imagine a move towards state level service years that can play a real role in connecting people across difference. I'll pause there. There's more, but No,
that's fascinating. And I've talked about it in past episodes, this idea of some sort of service required. I mean, I've told this story many times, but my late father grew up in mostly Western New York, Albany area, and Vermont. Went to the University of Vermont on ROTC, figured that was a safe bet because of World War II had just ended. Well, he's the first to go to Korea. But his basic training was the first time he ever shook hands with a black person. And changed the trajectory of his life, all of that. And his point was always, and he was a trustee at the University of Vermont, and they were always working on quote unquote diversity initiatives and that sort of thing. And his thing was, colleges and universities try their hardest. They do a good job, but nothing threw people together across class, across race, across everything as mandatory conscription. And thank goodness we're not fighting wars like Korea and World War II, and we don't need a draft. But as you're getting at, we are missing something, I think, with that opportunity to throw people together in some sort of cause or work.
Yeah. And that is something that, historically was done in, local community cultural settings. Then World War II really was the thing that instantiated this like kind of state intervention around the adult transition. There were a lot of negatives to World War II.
Right.
And what followed, don't get me wrong, but there were some positives around that I think can be insights around kind of service that's beyond the military. And so I think that's one affirmative thing that government can do, right? There are questions around cost, which I think are really real. Like that does cost money. And that is that would say, we value this as really, really important to kind of the social structure of our country. But it is something government can do.
Sam covered a lot of ground here, including how the COVID pandemic has led to more people working from home. We've discussed this issue on Blue Sky before, and I keep coming back to the notion that there are no doubt many benefits to this new model. But those of us making this transition should keep in mind some of the things that we might be losing, like a physical place to make connections and friendships. Sam's also put a tremendous amount of effort into structuring a framework for governments to help out with the work on building community. And in this final segment of our episode, Sam will tell us about some clever ideas that are already in place and working.
There are these examples of communities all over the country that offer basically like small micro grants for people to host block parties or neighborhood dinners or barbecues or all these things. Like Boston has one of them. And they are, if a fundamental issue right now is neighbors don't trust their neighbors, they don't know their neighbors, they like giving $500 for a block party to get a whole block together like just get interactions with one another, giving $250 for like neighborhood dinners. Like these are little things that cost very little money at the local level that can create kind of flywheels of interaction and connection and community. You can layer that on top with like providing, some funding and support for community, like neighborhood beautification and service projects, and having like some neighborhood leadership levels. But there's really small things that local government can do to enable just more participation and more connection in that community.
Did you say Boston has a program?
Yeah, Boston has one of the biggest ones. They have an Office of Civic Organizing, which is a small office run by a recent friend named Natalia, and they offer $30,000 a year in block party grants. Those block party grants are max, I think, $500, and I think they do 50 to 100 block parties a year, overrepresented in the poorer neighborhoods of Boston. So it's just really low lift thing that, if you talk to people in Boston, like they're very excited about the block parties. And there's no reason other cities couldn't do that. There's no reason other towns couldn't do that. It's just there's this shift in thinking that I think has to happen in local government, which goes from treating constituents and residents as kind of clients to be served, to kind of members, like they're a member of this community, and how do we see them as part of like a membership life cycle within this community? And so that can mean offering welcome kits to newcomers, like partnering with neighbors to offer welcome packages to newcomers.
You wrote about that, I think, Sam. I thought that was brilliant.
And there's now multiple cities across the country who are testing out offering welcome kits to newcomers after reading that newsletter. Like we can do, and from New England, where you're from, some cities still do this. We can do homecoming just for people who've left a place. Like you're from this town. We're going to have a homecoming weekend, and we're going to go kind of reconnect this town as like alumni of the place. Like there's all these little things that like can make us feel more connected to a place through membership. Whether when we're entering the place, when we're in their place in an ongoing basis, and even after we leave to kind of keep us connected later. And that's a shift in thinking. It's not necessarily big capital P policies.
I'll tell you, that's fascinating. And maybe I've spent my career really in the private sector for the most part, and thinking about, it's great if local governments will do that, but how about a large employer? How about, someone who's vested in that community?
Yeah, exactly.
It's easier for them to come up with the $500 in a lot of cases than a strapped local government. My goodness, what a simple opportunity. And, again, the first step is admitting you got a problem. I've read a lot about this stuff too. And just, the way we design homes and the way we design cities, and we went from front porches to back
Yeah, I love that.
porches, and
Yeah.
from common areas to internal atriums, and just understanding that and thinking about little ways we could break that up, like with block parties, is brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think your point on this piece around like community foundations, on private sector employee, these are things that, particularly because local government oftentimes needs proof that something's, so to speak, working.
Right.
To me, every community foundation in the country should have $50,000 to $100,000 budget for just like neighbor to neighbor engagement. And then that can be the proof point that government can then adopt moving forward. That could be sponsored by a local corporate foundation. Like, those things are really easy to do. Don't get me wrong, that's not going to solve all the problems. But if we're talking about little shifts that can be made to kind of enable more connection, that's definitely one of them. And so, yeah, I do think this is where again, we circle around this culture structure. I think we're at a shift of kind of peak individualism and turning back a little more towards getting excited by and imagining the communal. And there's all negative consequences of shifting too much to the collective or too much to the communal, but we've shifted so far to the individual that this like simple shift in vision to like, what would it look like to orient ourselves more towards connection? What would it look like to orient ourselves more towards cultivating community, and doing that not in a individualist way where it's like, here's an app to make friends, or like, this is what the expert tells you about community, but like actually doing it in a way that invites the community in and is done communally. Like, that is a small shift that can actually create real ripple effects in local places.
Okay, I'm going to give you a shift that I made up while I was researching this. I want to get your reaction. Here's a hopeful shift.
All right.
I call it from Peloton to pickleball.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
The rage during the pandemic was Peloton. Wonderful product, great service, helped get me through the pandemic. But you're alone on a bike with a live person, but they're in some place. Pickleball is the rage now. And I would argue that a lot of it is because it is de facto communal. You cannot, first of all, you can play singles, but it's not fun. And I'm not a pickleballer, but I've followed this. It's 4 people. It's often tournaments. It's other people waiting to use that same court. It's bringing people together. And there's a lot of reasons why it's popular, but I think behind it that very few people would realize unless they thought about it is a communal activity. I'm putting that out there for Sam Pressler to respond.
Yeah, I like the from blank. We had our fundraiser with ASAP was from combat to comedy. So
there you go, Peloton to pickleball.
That's right. I mean, and the insight. So what are the insights to draw out from that? Right. One, I think pickleball compared to other sports is fairly accessible. Like, pretty low barrier to entry.
Yes.
2, it's really fun.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's. And I think we underemphasize the fun part of this.
Yes, agree.
If we're to go back in our conversation, if I'm competing with Netflix, or if I'm competing with the NFL, or if I'm competing with blank, like, you better make something really fun.
Yeah.
And like, what was comedy for us? That was the fun hook. Like, people really wanted to do comedy. And so I think identifying these fun communal outlets. And then I think the final piece, right, is that community. And I think what is the importance of it being communal? Obviously, we've talked about all the health, all that stuff already. But if you have friends, or if you're making friends through that, it's those friends or those acquaintances that are going to be the strongest referrers to new communal activities, right?
Yes.
If you ask any community group, what's your number one source of new members or new participants? It's word of mouth, right? So it's going to be referrers.
Yes.
And those are going to be the people who are going to ask you to come back.
Yes.
Right. And like, I think what's underneath some of this, a lot of what we're talking about is people at an essential level need to feel needed. And as particularly people without college degrees, but many of us have become disconnected from religion, from unions, from work, from marriage and family, from just general community. We have fewer and fewer outlets to feel needed. And it's the people around us who count on us and we count on that are that source for feeling needed. And so, my example, I coach 8th grade basketball. These 8th graders respect me less than anyone I've ever met in my life. I'm a substitute teacher to them.
Yes.
And I wake up every morning thinking about how I'm going to do practice the next day because I feel like I'm needed. And then actually the amount that they make fun of me is offset by the fact that I feel somewhat needed by these kids, even if they would never admit it. And so I do think that's kind of underpinning a lot of what we're talking about.
Well, I could talk to you all day, Sam, but we do have to wrap things up. But before we do, I want you to mention your Connective Tissue newsletter. That's how I've been staying in touch with you and your work. Tell us about that and how can people find it?
Sure. Yeah. So about a year and a quarter ago, we launched this Connective Tissue newsletter, which was really just to do learning out loud around the policy framework that I was putting together. We were interviewing all these cool people. I was like, wow, we just have a lot of this interaction. It'd be great to share with the world as we go. And so we started that, and now it's grown well beyond my what I imagined. We're close to 4,000 subscribers now. And really, I think what it is it's this place to kind of mix really practical organizations and action around community building with, I would say, some like thoughtful engagement. I think a lot of the current discourse tends to be less thoughtful than I would hope. It tends to be very individual. It's like an individualistic communitarianism or individualistic kind of communalism. And so oftentimes we're challenging that. But we do original pieces, we do Q&As, we kind of curate lists of our favorite readings. And it's become the space to, I think, interrogate some of these things a little bit deeper. So you could check it out. It's the Connective Tissue newsletter. It's on Substack. And yeah, please engage with it and let us know what you think.
It's really well done, really well written. And if anyone's interested in anything we talked about today, check it out. It's really worth it. Sam Pressler, I can't thank you enough. It's been great getting to know you, and you've helped me so much with my Blue Sky podcast. And now finally I'm putting the spotlight on you, as it's so well deserved. And I really enjoyed this conversation.
Well, thank you. I mean, it's been really cool is not the most inspirational word. It's been really cool to have a friend who has been able to give this platform to so many of the people that I know who I think are doing really groundbreaking work around like what the next 50 years of community building are going to look like and don't necessarily have an outlet. And so for you to kind of spotlight them, it's a real mitzvah. So thank you.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Sam. Sam gives us a lot to think about here, and this notion of local governments pitching in with welcoming kits and grants for block parties sounds to me like simple, inexpensive, and targeted ways to get people together and interacting with neighbors. And Sam's overall message is clearly striking a chord, with his newsletter already past 4,000 subscribers. As a reminder, it's called Connective Tissue, and I strongly encourage you to check it out. And Sam gave me my first ever mitzvah shout out, to which I think we can all agree that his work is truly a mitzvah as well. I hope you enjoyed this Blue Sky conversation with Sam Pressler. Before you go, please take a minute to leave us a rating or review. These help us keep making our shows better, and they also make it easier for new listeners to find us. While you're at it, you might want to subscribe to Blue Sky wherever you get your podcasts. Sign up for the Blue Sky Weekend newsletter at theoptimisminstitute.com and follow us on social media. This and all Blue Sky episodes are made possible by the incredible editing and mixing done by the team at Sound On Sound Off. You can learn more about their work at soundonsoundoff.com. And all graphic design and cover art for Blue Sky and the Optimism Institute are provided by Crush Graphics. And that's Crush with a K if you'd like to check out more of their fantastic work at crushgraphics.com. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.